Welcome to the Heart Failure Collaboratory, Heart of the Matter. I'm Chris O'Connor, PI of the Heart Failure Collaboratory, and I'm here with my distinguished guest to talk about a very exciting topic on the cardiovascular kidney metabolic syndrome and some of the quantitative methods we're starting to use now to help design and conduct clinical trials, but also how we can be better in our clinical practice. And I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves. Dr. Javed Butler.
Hi, Javed Butler. I'm a cardiologist and clinical trialist with Baylor Scott & White Health in Dallas and professor of medicine at University of Mississippi. Great to be here, Chris.
Thank you. Carine?
Hi, everyone. Carine Hamo. I am a heart failure cardiologist at NYU Langone Health and a member of the Heart Failure Collaboratory, and very excited for this discussion on CKM.
And Ankeet.
Hi, everyone. Ankeet Bhatt. I'm a cardiologist and clinical investigator at Kaiser Permanente in San Francisco. Excited to talk to you all today.
Well, let's kick it off with Javed. He's old enough to have been around the block a little bit and has been really at the forefront of thinking about metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular, kidney metabolic interactions for many, many years. I remember, Javed, when you were in leadership role at the AHA, putting forth these concepts with diabetes and integrating them in the whole concept. Tell us about your framework today of CKM and how we should be thinking about clinical trial development of new therapeutics in heart failure.
Yeah, certainly, Chris. So, for the longest time, we knew that these comorbidities tends to accumulate in patients, and many of these patients are multimorbid: diabetes, prediabetes, CKD, heart failure, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, maybe in the future, liver. But our understanding was that these are sort of bi-directional relationships, right? I mean, old people tend to get more diseases. Maybe heart failure leads to poor cardiac output. You develop kidney disease, something like that. But now what we are realizing is that there is an underlying milieu in which the body lives, right? Inflammation, adiposity, oxidative stress, endothelial dysfunction, insulin resistance, that actually simultaneously puts you at risk for all of these diseases at the same time. Now, that's a bad news because even if you have one disease, you can pretty much be certain that the other disease has already started subclinically and it's only a matter of time. And unfortunately, if you look at the outcomes data, 1 + 1 is sadly not 2, but it's like 3 or 4. So if you have heart failure, you have bad prognosis. You have CKG, you have bad prognosis. You have the two of them together, the prognosis is really bad. But having said that, there are a couple of really good news as well. That if you have fundamental therapies that underlie the sort of the milieu in which the body lives, because it's the same therapy that leads to development of the disease if you don't have the disease in high-risk patients, and if you have the disease, progression of the disease, that if you give effective therapies, you're affecting both prevention or delaying of the disease or treatment of the disease. And interestingly, I may give the therapy for one disease and Carine may give it for another disease. Simultaneously, you'll get multiple organ system benefit. And that's where this whole genesis of CKM came about. That is the same underlying pathophysiology. The treatments are largely overlapping. Why don't we think about the human body in an integrated manner rather than individual diseases at a time?
Really well said. And Ankeet, this sort of concept that Javed just outlined really stimulated your interest for us to think more holistically about heart failure patients and therapeutic development in this space and be broader in our thinking. Tell us how you came about thinking about this CKM score and the work that's been done behind that.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think Javed said it so nicely. We had an understanding fundamentally that these conditions coexist and they may interact with each other. But we've had sort of serendipitous wins that I think really kind of pushed us forward. One is that there are therapies, a singular therapy has shown benefit across multiple of these disease states, suggesting that some of these therapies may be modifying underlying pathways that exist and that are risk factors for all of these different diseases. The second is, in some cases, we've been lucky. We've done a trial and we've tried to assess the importance of a particular endpoint, but we've learned something new from that trial, that that same therapy might actually be beneficial in something adjacent. If the SGLT2 inhibitor story is a good example of that. And so putting this all together, the fundamental conserved pathophysiology, the fact that we have overlying treatment, and the fact that we may be able to generate new insights from our trials really spurred us to do two things. The first was to develop a simple but comprehensive lean case report form that we hope will become a standard bearer for folks doing clinical trials in this area. And this has, we think, benefits across a number of things. One, it collects the comorbid CKM conditions, which we know will influence the condition that you're trying to study. It also allows us to gather the secondary endpoints that may generate novel insights about where this therapy may be beneficial. And it allows us to get a holistic picture about the potential benefits of that therapy. So when we try to communicate it to payers, to patients, to regulators and others, we can communicate the holistic picture of where we think that therapy might be beneficial. Paired with that, we wanted to get, as you said, a quantitative understanding of, can we understand how optimized a patient might be? We're pretty used to seeing table ones in clinical trials list the different therapies that are within that class. But now that story is much more complex because there's other disease states that are just adjacent that are also affecting this picture. And so we wanted to put together something that was simple, something that was intuitive, something that could be modified as the evidence accrues, to get a singular score about how optimized a patient is in the context of the CKM conditions that they currently have.
Well, and you brought up some really important points, and I want Corinne to comment on these. One, the lean case report form. How many times have we done a clinical trial and we collected 3,000 patients and we said, "Oh gosh, I forgot that variable. You got to be kidding me." So now the collaboratory has put forth these publicly available documents so that developers should look at these lean case report forms as a framework. They can obviously build on top of them, but important framework that you may detect a new signal. We would have never detected the AFib signals in some of these therapies if we hadn't, collected the data. But again, and also quantitating the optimization of therapy, Corinne. I think this is really important because as heart failure doctors now, we are really taking the space of where endocrinology has traditionally been. I remember when I first came to Nova, I wrote a prescription for an SGLT2, and one of this real senior physician says, "Oh no, you got to get that approved by an endocrinologist." I said, "Oh my God, we got work to do." But tell us about, Corinne, why this is so important that we've expanded our thinking beyond just the heart muscle, the heart function, that we're talking about a much broader aspect of this condition that we call heart failure.
Yeah, and I think Javed, explained it nicely, which is the idea that we now appreciate more that these organs do not operate and function in silos. All these organ systems talk together and integrate to ultimately drive cardiovascular disease risk, heart failure risk, peripheral arterial disease, all these elements that constitute stage 4 CKM, or clinical cardiovascular disease. And so you're right that, as cardiologists, we can't really just, focus on the heart muscle and medications that primarily target the myocardium, or, the coronary arteries. We really do have to take a step back and understand all of the different drivers of cardiovascular risk, which, now we understand are really primarily these metabolic, kidney, obesity risk factors. And we do have to ultimately sort of put on all those different hats, be the nephrologist, be the endocrinologist, manage their weight, all with the understanding that we have to take care of the patient in front of us. And, and in order to, if the focus is even just to reduce cardiovascular and heart failure risk, in order to do that, we have to think about all these other organ systems as well.
And Javed, so we've got all these new therapies coming, all this development. We're targeting obesity, we're targeting all these comorbidities. You know, what what has changed about the way we have to design clinical trials from the standpoint of the phenotype at entry of a heart failure patient, the inclusion exclusion criteria, and the endpoints? And this will be a topic for the whole panel. We'll start with you, Javed.
Yeah, so I mean that's the beauty of the score, right? So at the end of the day, we are now having, more and more therapies. And actually, it's not that this is a new discovery, it's just that a new way of thinking. If you look at ACE inhibitors, they kind of do the same thing. It's just that we were not thinking like that, right? But now it goes way beyond SGLT2 inhibitor, all the data that is coming out with aldosterone modulation, with GLP-1 receptor agonist. So I think we are sort of in that era. Now, at the end of the day, you will never have all patients be on all drugs, right? Tolerability, stage of the disease. And on the other hand, when you introduce a new therapy, which has its own set of side effects, which has its own set of costs, you just want to make sure that there is an incremental benefit, that you already do the things that you're supposed to do. And where the score like this helps is that when you're phenotyping the patients coming into the trial, whatever trial you're doing, that you look at comprehensively multiple diseases, but also the therapies for those multiple diseases, because they all affect each other's outcome. A therapy for heart failure will likely give better outcomes for the patients if simultaneously diabetes is controlled versus diabetes is not well controlled, right? So the CKM score tells us what kind of patients you're getting in. If somebody's score is really low, well, make sure to figure out why and that somebody has been optimized and they simply have contraindications so they cannot tolerate. That's a different phenogroup. We want to look at subgroup at the end of the trial, see what the outcomes are like. But at baseline, also make sure that the patients are really optimized so that whatever the results are, you can be pretty confident in the clinical setting that you can sit down with the patient and tell them that addition of this medication will give you incremental benefit.
Really well said. Now, Ankeet, as soon as you publish this score, we've got lots of evidence that the GLP-1 influence liver health, hepatic health, and that could be an additional area of targeted of benefit for these drugs. We've seen benefit from the GLP-1s in that space, and we've also seen the lipid guidelines come out with much more aggressive targets. So the score is a living document. Tell us how that works.
Yeah, so thanks, Chris, for the opportunity. So the score is intended to be a living document, just like our knowledge is intended to be a continuous journey. And if we went with that intention in trying to build the score, that this is a tool, that this tool needs to be updated with the highest quality evidence. And now we have lots of digital tools that can help support that. And so, our vision for this is that this will be a readily updated tool. As new evidence accrues, we'd be able to host this in an electronic format that allows people to access the latest version of this score. And to Javed's point, we kind of see this as really playing a part in the whole aspect of a clinical trial development. As you're thinking about how do I power a trial, not only do we have to think about heart failure and heart failure trials, we need to think about all of the other conditions that go into it. And so could we understand the comorbid conditions patients have in real world care and how they're treated to help inform, for example, event estimation and powering? Second, to Javed's point, who are the patients that we get in the trial? Third, how do those patients change with respect to medical optimization during the trial? And is that different between those allocated to the intervention group and the placebo group at the end of the day? Fourth, does the therapy have benefit across the full heterogeneity of CKM score optimization, of comorbid condition optimization? And finally, to Javed's point about talking to the patient, can this tell us that, on a well-treated patient, this therapy is really going to provide an incremental benefit. So we sort of see this as end to end. Now, of course, this is an early construct, and we'll see where this takes us. But that's our vision for how this score might be used going forward.
And we'll ask the panelists their final recommendations to the audience, clinical trialists, people developing new therapies in this space. Carine, what would your important guidance be?
Yeah, so first, I think, now that there is growing recognition of this CKM construct, I think it's important moving forward that we prospectively collect, and identify first where individuals lie on the spectrum, what stage within the CKM trajectory they lie on based on their risk factors, whether it's, weight, renal dysfunction, now perhaps liver dysfunction, metabolic syndrome, hypertension. And then in addition to that, once we've sort of staged someone on the CKM scale, thinking about what therapies we're going to develop to try and mitigate their risk. And also, the CKM score and the lean CRF, in prospectively collecting this information, we will be able to also tease out in drug development, are there benefits to the individual components of CKM, or is there some kind of global benefit, getting to Javed's point about this underlying shared pathophysiology? So I think the more data that we capture, now that we recognize what CKM is and its contribution to heart disease and heart failure, the more we'll be able to delineate that.
Really well said. Ankeet, what would a final word be to developers?
Yeah, of course I'm biased here, but the I think the importance is that right now, I really see this as a collaboration point among sponsors, because I think everybody wins if, for example, if we're just able to collect standardized data in the lean case report form, we will likely uncover things that we may not have previously. And I think that is good for the entire industry and ultimately good for patients, which is what we all care about. So that is, I think, my sort of hope, that we can embrace a limited set of very important things that we think should be collected across all CKM trials.
And really set us up for pooled analyses, meta-analyses with individual patients. Javed, final word for our audience.
Yeah, Chris, so thanks to the collaboratory for facilitating work, and Anki did sort of all the heavy work. I would actually take a few steps back and say that anybody who's in the space of development of new therapies for cardiovascular disease or adjacent things like CKD, diabetes, obesity, but also if you're in the implementation sciences space, or actually you're not even doing research, you're a hospital administrator who is doing quality improvement and care patterns, just read this paper, because it's not only about the score. In one place, you will get all the background information of CKM and clinical trials and data and science, and then all the various ways that you can implement it. So my one word is, go, please read this paper. It's an excellent paper, and kudos to Ankeet.
Well, thank you. Terrific conversation. I want to thank my colleagues for really stimulating this conversation, and we'll be back to talk about this more. This field is changing very, very fast. And I want to thank the audience for being here with Heart of the Matter from the Heart Failure Collaboratory, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.